Slight switch up to the usual standard content that we produce, but figured why not. So we're going to have a look at MAFS, not MAFS as in the subject, but MAFS as in Married at First Sight. And the Australian series started last week. And in that series, we obviously get to meet the new couples and we get to find out a bit about them. But one of the fundamental flaws with the social experiment itself is actually the fact that they never seem to deal with any of the trauma. And what I mean by that is, as much as you have obviously the three panelists and you get to have their matching process and understand a little bit about how they put people together, then where is the trauma side ever looked at? And what I mean by this is we're having a look at where people are saying they're one thing and they're not. We're also having a look at where they have their own insecurities and they have this patterns, habits, behaviours and conditioning that runs in the background. And also there are flaws within those structures, but ultimately on a grander scale, we're having people partnered or put together in order to resolve these issues. And that just isn't what is happening within this show. So I get the fact that obviously it's a social experiment. I get the fact that it's set up for entertainment purposes, but some of the key fundamental issues within the program itself need to be addressed. And what I mean by that is, spoiler alert, if you have a look at this series, we have lots of people being matched for specific reasons. So you have the two sets of twins, and clearly they have to have their own identities away from their other twin, because otherwise you have a crossover whereby we're not looking at it from a place of, well, hold on, we are our own independent person, but then that itself will constantly lead to friction and tension because of the drawback to the other twin. And then you also have situations whereby you have people put together that have underlying concepts that are basically designed to be balanced out. And when we balance them out, we can actually get to the point where the initial phase, which is meant to be the honeymoon phase, whereby you can consciously create, you can come together, and obviously you can then work out what you two individuals would create a life like before all the programming and the conditioning kicks in that you then have to work through. And with these guys, obviously in the show, it speeds up that part of that process. And because it's speeding up that part of that process, then we can get a snapshot and get an insight into how their relationship is going to manifest and create and develop itself moving forwards. When they're put together, they're obviously put together for whatever their matching reasons are, but there are underlying energetic components. And there are also parts that need to be reconciled. And if you watched yesterday's episode, so we're looking at Tuesday the 11th at time of this recording, they had their first dinner party. And in that first dinner party, what then happens is you have everything come to a head. So Tim and Katie is one of the major points of note. And because Tim obviously isn't taking accountability on his side for his actions, then what ultimately has to happen is it has to be transferred over at some point to Katie. But Katie also isn't assured in her actions and her accountability, and therefore you get this crossover. And the crossover itself confuses both of them, which leads to the gaslighting, which has obviously been highlighted. We have to look back and realise is that they are all coming from a similar background where there is a skewing or a dysfunction within that structure and that setup. That setup itself is one where Katie has her own insecurities about her own image, and she's obviously expecting to be rejected, which gives you a gap and opens up the door for that to happen. We also have Tim, who is not sure of himself, and because he's not sure of himself, then he questions his self, because Katie technically is a direct mirror to him based on where he's at and that subsequent dysfunction. But the two gaps between them need to work themselves out in order to then correct the balance so that both of them can then move forward. But what then happens is, because Tim isn't taking accountability for his feelings and potentially doesn't want to hurt the other person, he has individuation issues from past, but there's people talking about how he's a plant and how he's been set up and how it's all been fabricated. But the reality is you can't play that role that well, right? You have to have an underlying subconscious bit of programming that allows you to show up in that manner. Because if you have a look at the awkwardness of how he plays with his ring all the time, if you have a look at the body language and the position and the social anxiety that then comes with it, there is all of this underlying problem that needs to correct itself in the background. While also on the flip side, Katie has to do her work. But to top it all off, we then have Jamie, who has passed with this type of gaslighting. If she herself hasn't balanced her experiences and reconciled her experiences, then what she'll do is she'll side with somebody who is most like her, and therefore it becomes a protection mechanism, but not from a place of balance, from a place of imbalance. And that imbalance then gets to the position whereby it brings itself to a head. So technically all three of them, bearing in mind we're in the third dimension, but we work off polarity concepts and principles, are not going to get out of that structure and that situation. But you can guarantee that when they come to discuss the relationships, they'll factor in part of Jamie in terms of her inputs and what she thought she saw. But what they won't do is they won't sit down and reconcile that trauma. They won't sit down and go, between the three of you, how do we get to a place of balance so that, worst case, you can give this part of your relationship during the experiment a chance, but you can also take that beyond the experiment should it still not work out. And what we don't see is we don't ever see that happening. And then you get to the couch and it's just point the finger at somebody and say that you are obviously causing the feelings in somebody else, which is doubling down on the lack of accountability. Because the individual themselves are accountable for how they think, how they act and they feel, because that ultimately creates their reality. If they're not doing so, then it leaves the door open for a trigger to be pressed, but ultimately that trigger is designed for that individual's healing personally. But because of the lack of accountability, it's not looked at and not dealt with in that manner. So what then happens is people that aren't accountable are held accountable for something that they're not accountable for. And then you get this loop and this cycle that perpetually then manifests and then expands, because the more people on top of the layering, the more people, the more people, the more people, then you get to a position whereby everybody is confused on a grand scale and nobody is in a position to ever actually deal with the underlying root causes of the problem. And then we also see this with Elliot. He has his issues going on in the background, but he's not willing to change. But then Lauren herself has a inauthentic view of self that's not from a place of balance. And because of all of these things that then come on top of each other, you're never going to get out of that cycle, because nobody is holding anybody accountable for what's actually correct. But we did see a part of it with John yesterday, whereby he did speak to Elliot. And having spoken to Elliot, then he's obviously in a position whereby he's highlighted it and Elliot hasn't returned. And that's the fundamental thing. If you're going to do the healing work, then you have to actually face the accountability. And that's the most difficult thing that anybody can do. But it's also the first point where you can begin the journey. If you'd like to see more of this type of content, where we take real life situations and we apply the context and the concepts to it, then let me know in the comments below. And if you've got any specific characters that you relate to or that you want further information about, or you just want me to have a quick look at, then also drop that in the comments below as well. But as always, until next time, trust the process, and it's bye for now.